Hi, we are back for the final chapter of The Hiding Place. And the title of this chapter is The Three Visions. So here we go. The beauty of Betsy's face sustained me over the next days as I went from one to another of the women who had loved her, describing to them her peace and her joy. 2 mornings after her death, the Count was off at roll call. The other barracks were dismissed. 28 remained in ranks, eyes front. The loudspeaker beeped and a voice came on. A woman was missing. The entire barracks would stand on the Lagerstrasse until she was found. Left, left, right, endlessly tramping to drive the chill from weary legs. The sun came up, a wan, wintry sun that did not warm. I looked down at my feet. My legs and my ankles were swelling grotesquely. By noontime there was no feeling in them. Betsy, how happy you are today. No cold, no hunger, nothing between you and the face of Jesus. The dismissal order came in the afternoon. We learned later that the missing woman had been found dead on one of the upper platforms. It was the following morning when over the loudspeaker during roll call came the word, "Ten Boom, Cornelia." For an instant I stood stupidly where I was. I had been prisoner 66730 for so long that I almost failed to react to my name. I walked forward. "Stand to the side." What was going to happen? Why had I been singled out? Had someone reported the Bible? The roll call dragged on. From where I stood, I could see almost the entire Lagerstrasse. Tens of thousands of women stretching out of sight, their breath hanging white in the night air. The siren blew for dismissal. The guard signaled to me to follow her. I splashed through the slush, trying to keep up with the strides of her tall boots. My legs and feet were still painfully swollen from the long count the day before. My shoes were held together with bits of string. I hobbled behind the guard into the administration barracks at the opposite end of the Lagerstrasse from the hospital. Several prisoners were standing in line at a large desk. An officer seated behind it stamped a paper and handed it to the woman in front of him. "Entlassen," he said. Entlassen? Released? Was the woman free then? Were we all? He called a name, and another prisoner stepped to the desk. A signature, a stamp, "Entlassen." At last, "Ten Boom, Cornelia," was called. I stepped to the desk, steadying myself against it. He wrote, brought down the stamp, and then I was holding it in my hand. A piece of paper with my name and birthday on it, and across the top, in large black letters, "Certificate of Discharge." Dazed, I followed the others through a door at our left. There at another desk I was handed a railway pass entitling me to transportation through Germany to the Dutch border. Outside this office, a guard pointed me down a corridor into still another room. There the prisoners who had been ahead of me were tugging their dresses over their heads and lining up against the rear wall. "Clothing over here," a smiling prison trustee told me. And loss in physical, she explained. I drew the Bible over my head along with the dress, rolled them together, and buried the bundle to the bottom of the clothing pile. I joined the others, the wooden wall rough against my bare back. Strange how the very word release had made the procedures of prison 100 times more hateful. How often Betsy and I had stood like this, but the thought of freedom had stirred in me, and the shame of this inspection was greater than all the others. At last the doctor arrived, a freckled-faced boy in a military uniform. He glanced along the lineup with undisguised contempt. One by one, we had to bend, turn around, spread our fingers. When he reached me, his eyes traveled down to my feet, and his lips puckered in disgust. Edema, he said. Hospital. He was gone. With one other woman who had not passed, I scrambled back into my clothes and followed the trustee from the building. Day had broken, a sullen gray sky spitting snow. We started up the Lagerstrasse, past the endless streets of barracks. Then, aren't we to be released? I imagined you will be as soon as the swelling in your legs goes down, the trustee said. They only release you if you're in good condition. I saw her look at the other prisoner. The woman's skin and eyes were a dull, dark yellow. Sick call stretched around the side of the hospital, but we walked straight through the door and into a ward at the rear. The room was crammed with double-decker cots. I was assigned a place on an upper bunk next to a woman whose body was covered with erupting pustules. But at least it was near a wall where I could keep my swollen legs elevated. That was what mattered now, to get the swelling down, to pass the inspection. Whether that ray of freedom shed a new, relentless light on Ravensbrück, or whether this was truly the most savage place yet, I could not tell. The suffering was unimaginable. Around me were survivors of a prison train that had been bombed on its way here. The women were horribly mutilated and in terrible pain, but at each moan, two of their nurses jeered and mimicked the sounds. Even in the other patients, I saw that stony indifference to others that was the most fatal disease of the concentration camp. I felt it spread to myself. How could one survive if one kept on feeling? The paralyzed and the unconscious kept falling out of the crowded, narrow cots. That first night, 4 women fell from upper bunks and died on the floor. It was better to narrow the mind to one's own need, not to see, not to think. But there was no way to shut out the sounds. All night, women cried out a German word I didn't know, Scheibe, over and over from rasping throats. Scheibe! Finally, I realized they were calling for bedpans. It was out of question for the most of the women in this room to make it to the filthy latrine next door. At last, reluctant to lower my legs, I climbed down from my cot and set about the chore. The gratitude of the patients was heart-wrenching. Who are you? Why are you doing this? As though cruelty and callousness were the norm, ordinary decency the marvel. As a wintry dawn crept through the windows, I realized it was Christmas Day. As a wintry dawn crept through the windows, I realized it was Christmas Day. I went each morning to the clinic at the front of the hospital, where I could hear the tramping of feet on the Lagerstrasse outside. Each time the verdict was, edema of the feet and ankles. Many of those who attended the clinic were, like myself, discharged prisoners. Some had been released months ago. Their discharge papers and railway passes were ragged from opening and refolding. And what if Betsy were still alive? Surely our prison term would have been up together, but Betsy would never, never have passed the physical. What if she were here with me? What if I were to pass the inspection and she... There are no ifs in God's kingdom. I could hear her voice saying, His timing is perfect. His will is our hiding place. Lord Jesus, keep me in your will. Don't let me go mad by poking about outside it. I kept looking for someone to give the Bible to. How easy it would be back in Holland to get another, 100 others. There were not many Hollanders in the ward who would be able to read the Dutch text, but at last I slipped it around the neck of a grateful young woman from Utrecht. The 6th night I spent in the ward, both bedpans were suddenly and mysteriously missing. In an upper bunk on the center aisle were the 2 Hungarian gypsies whose muttering was part of the babble of the room. I never walked past their cot, because one of them had a gangrenous foot that she would thrust in the face of anyone who came near. Now someone screamed out that the gypsies had the bedpans hidden under their blankets to save them the trip to the toilets. I went to their cot and pleaded with them, though I didn't know whether they understood German or not. Suddenly in the dark, something wet and sticky coiled around my face. The woman had taken the bandage from her foot and flung it at me. I ran sobbing down the corridor and washed beneath the wall spigot in the latrine. I would never step into that aisle again. What did I care about the wretched bedpans? I couldn't bear... But of course, I did go back. I had learned much in the past year about what I could and could not bear. As the gypsies saw me heading down the aisle toward them, both bedpans clattered onto the floor. The next morning, the doctor on duty at the clinic stamped the medical approval on my discharge form. Events that had dragged so slow now moved with bewildering speed. In a dressing shed near the outer gate of the camp, I was outfitted with clothes. Underthings, a woolen skirt, a truly beautiful silk blouse, sturdy, almost new shoes, a hat, an overcoat. I was handed a form to sign stating that I had never been ill at Ravensbrück, never had an accident, and that the treatment had been good. I signed. In another building, I received a day's bread ration and food coupons for 3 additional days. I was also given back my watch, my Dutch money, and Mama's ring. And then I was standing with a group of 10 or 12 just inside the gate. The heavy iron doors swung open. At the heels of a woman guard, we marched through. We climbed the little hill. Now I could see the lake, frozen from shore to shore. The pines in the distant church steeple sparkled in the winter sun like an old-fashioned Christmas card. I could not believe it. Perhaps we were only going to the Siemens factory. Tonight we would march back to camp. But at the top of the hill we turned left, toward the center of the small town. I could feel my feet swelling in the tight new shoes, but I bit my lip and made myself stride along. I imagined the guard turning around, pointing a scornful finger. Edima, send her back to the camp. At the small train station, the guard turned and left us without a backward glance. Apparently, we were all traveling as far as Berlin, then each pursuing her separate route home. There was a long wait on cold iron benches. The feeling of unreality persisted. Only one thing seemed familiar, the hungry hollow in my stomach. I put off getting into my bread allowance as long as I could, but at last reached into my overcoat pocket. The packet was gone. I sprang up from the bench, looking beneath it, retracing my steps through the station. Whether I had dropped it or it had been stolen, the bread was gone, and with it, the ration coupons. At last, a train pulled into the station. We crowded eagerly to it, but it was for military personnel only. Late in the afternoon, we were allowed to board a mail train, only to be put off 2 stops farther on to make room for a food shipment. The trip became a blur. We reached the huge bomb-gutted terminal in Berlin sometime after midnight. It was New Year's Day, 1945. Betsy had been right. She and I were out of prison. Snow drifted down from a shattered skylight as I wandered, confused and frightened, through the cavernous station. I knew that I must find the train to Uelzen, but months of being told what to do had left me robbed of initiative. At last, someone directed me to a distant platform. Each stop now was agony in the stiff new shoes. When I reached the platform at last, the sign said not Uelzen, but Olsztyn, a town in Poland, in exactly the opposite direction. I had to cross those acres of concrete floors again. Ahead of me, an elderly man, pink-cheeked from working in the roofless station, was raking bomb rubble into a pile. When I asked him for direction, he took me by the arm and led me himself to the proper platform. "I was to Holland once," he said, in a voice wistful with recollection. "When the wife was alive, you know. Right on the sea we stayed." A train was standing on the track, and I climbed aboard. It was hours before anyone else arrived, but I did not dare get off, for fear I would not find my way back again. By the time the train started up, I was dizzy for lack of food. At the first stop outside Berlin, I followed the other passengers into the station cafe. I showed the woman behind the cash box my Dutch guilders and told her I had lost my coupons. "That's an old story. Get out of here before I call the police." The trip was endless. Many miles of track could be traveled only at a crawl. Some sections were gone altogether, and there were interminable long detours and many changes of train. Often we did not stop in a station at all, for fear of air raids, but exchanged freight and passengers in the countryside. And all the while out my window passed once beautiful Germany, fire-blackened woods, the gaunt ribs of a church standing over a ruined village. Bremen especially brought tears to my eyes. In all that wasteland, I saw one human being, an old woman poking at a heap of bricks. At Uelzen, there was a long wait between trains. It was late at night. The station was deserted. As I dozed in an empty coffee bar, my head dropped forward until it rested on a small table in front of me. A blow on my ear sent me sprawling across the floor. "This is not a bedroom," the furious station agent shrieked. "You can't use our tables to sleep on." Trains came. Trains didn't come. I climbed on and off, and then I was standing in a line at a customs shed, and the sign on the little station building said, "Neuerstraße, Neuwerkstraße." As I left the building, a workman in a blue cap and blue overalls stepped up to me. "Here, you won't get far on those legs. Hang on to my arm." He spoke Dutch. I clung to him and hobbled across some tracks to where another train was waiting, engine already puffing smoke. I was in Holland. We jerked forward. Flat, snow-covered fields glided past the window. Home. It was still occupied Holland. German soldiers still stood at intervals along the tracks. But it was home. The train was going only as far as Groningen, a Dutch city not far from the border. Beyond that, rails were torn up and all except government travel banned. With the last of my strength, I limped to a hospital near the station. A nurse in a sparkling white uniform invited me into a little office. When I had told my story, she left the room. In a few minutes, she was back with a tray of tea and rusk. "I left the butter off," she said. "You're suffering from malnutrition. You must be careful what you eat." Tears tumbled into the hot tea as I drank. It was someone who felt concern for me. There were no available beds in the hospital, she said, but one of the staff was away, and I was to have her room. Right now, I have a hot tub running. I followed her down gleaming corridors in a kind of happy dream. In a large bathroom, clouds of steam were rising from a glistening white tub. Nothing in my life ever felt as good as that bath. I lay submerged to my chin, feeling the warm water soothe my scab-crusted skin. "Just 5 minutes more," I would beg each time the nurse rapped at the door. At last I let her hand me a nightgown and lead me to a room where a bed was turned down and waiting. Sheets, white sheets, top and bottom. I could not get enough of running my hands over them. The nurse was tucking a second pillow beneath my swollen feet. I struggled to stay awake. To lie here clean and cared for was such joy. I did not want to sleep through a minute of it. I stayed in the hospital at Groningen 10 days, feeling my strength return. For most meals, I joined the nurses in their own dining room. The first time I saw the long table set with silverware and glasses, I drew back in alarm. "You're having a party." Let me take a tray to my room. I did not feel ready yet for laughter and social chatter. The young woman beside me laughed as she pulled out a chair for me. "It's not a party. It's just supper, and skimpy enough at that." I sat down, blinking at knives, forks, tablecloth. Had I once eaten like this every day in a year? Like a savage watching his first civilized meal, I copied the leisurely gestures of the others as they passed bread and cheese and unhurriedly stirred their coffee. The ache in my heart was to get to Willem and Norley, but how could it be done with the travel ban? Telephone service, too, was more limited than ever, but at last the girl at the hospital switchboard reached the telephone operator in Hilversum with the news of Betsy's death and my release. In the middle of the second week, hospital authorities arranged a ride for me on a food truck headed south. We made the illegal trip at night and without headlights. The food had been diverted from a shipment headed for Germany. In the gray early morning, the truck pulled up to Willem's big brick nursing home. A tall, broad-shouldered girl answered my knock, and then went dashing down the hallway with the news that I was here. In a moment, my arms were around Tine and two of my nieces. Willem arrived more slowly, limping down the corridor with the help of a cane. We held each other a long time while I told them the details of Betsy's illness and death. "Almost," said Willem slowly. "Almost I could wish to have this same news of Keek. It would be good for him to be with Betsy and father." They had had no word of this tall blond son since his deportation to Germany. I remembered his hand on my shoulder, guiding me on our bicycles through the blacked-out streets to Pickwick's. Remembered his patient coaching. "You have no cards, Tante Corey. There are no Jews. Keek, are the young and brave as vulnerable as the old and slow. I spent 2 weeks in Hilversum trying to adjust to what my eyes had told me that first moment. Willem was dying. Only he seemed unaware of it as he hobbled along the halls of his home, bringing comfort and counsel to the sick people in his care. They had over 50 patients at the moment, but what I could not get over was the number of young women in help. Nurses' aides, kitchen helpers, secretaries. It was several days before I perceived that most of these girls were young men in hiding from the forced labor conscription, which had grown more ruthless than ever. And still something in me could not rest until I got back to Haarlem. Nolly was there, of course, but it was the Beje too. Something in the house itself that called me, beckoned me, told me to come home. The problem again was getting there. Willem had the use of an official car for nursing home business, but only within a radius of Hilversum. Finally, after many relayed phone calls, he told me the trip had been arranged. The roads were described as deserted as we set out. We passed only 2 other cars all the way to the rendezvous spot with a car from Haarlem. Ahead, pulled off onto the snow at the side of the road, we saw it. A long black limousine with official government plates and curtained rear windows. I kissed Willem goodbye and then stepped quickly, as instructed, into the rear of the limousine. Even in the curtained gloom, the ungainly bulk beside me was unmistakable. Herman, I cried. My dear Cornelia. His great hand closed around both of mine. God permits me to see you again. I had last seen Pickwick sitting between 2 soldiers on the prison bus in The Hague, his poor bald head bruised and bleeding. Now, here he was, waving aside my sympathy as though that had been an incident too trivial to recall. He seemed as well informed as ever about everything that went on in Haarlem, and as the uniformed driver sped us along the empty roads, he filled me in on all the details I ached to know. All of our Jews were safe except Mary Itali, who had been sent to Poland following her arrest in the street. Our group was still operating, although many of the young men were in hiding. He wanted me to expect changes at the Beje. After the police guard had been removed, a series of homeless families had been housed there, although at the moment he believed the living quarters above the shop were empty. Even before the house was unsealed, loyal Toos had returned from Scheveningen and reopened the watch business. Mr. Boukers, the optician next door, had given her space in his shop, from which she had taken orders to give our repairmen in their homes. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I made out my friend's face more clearly. There was perhaps an extra knob or 2 on the misshapen head. Teeth were missing. But to that vast, kindly ugliness, the beating had made no real difference at all. Now the limousine was threading the narrow streets of Haarlem, over the bridge on the Spaan, across the Grote Markt in the shadow of St. Bavo's, into Bartholdistraat. I was out of the car almost before it stopped, running down the alley through the side door and into Nolly's embrace. She and her girls had been there all morning, sweeping, washing windows, airing sheets for my homecoming. Over Nolly's shoulder I saw Toos standing in the rear door to the shop, laughing and sobbing both at once, laughing because I was home, crying because Father and Betsy, the only 2 people she had ever allowed herself to love, would never be. Together we trooped through the house and shop, looking, stroking. Remember how Betsy would set out these cups. Remember how Meta would scold Jussi for leaving his pipe here. I stood on the landing outside the dining room and ran my hand over the smooth wood at the Frisian clock. I could see Father stopping here, Captain at his heels. We mustn't let the clock run down. I opened the glass vase, moved the hands to agree with my wristwatch, and slowly drew up the weights. I was home. Life, like the clock, started again. Mornings repairing watches in the workshop, noons most often bumping on my tireless bicycle out to Bos in Hovenstraat. And yet, in a strange way, I was not home. I was still waiting, still looking for something. I spent days prowling the alleys and canal banks nearby, calling Maher Shalal Hasbaz by name. The elderly vegetable lady 3 stores down told me that the cat had mewed at her door the night of our arrest, and she had taken him in. For months, she said, the small children of the neighborhood had banded together to bring food to Opa's kitty. They had brought scraps from garbage pails and even tidbits from their own scanty plates, smuggled past watchful mothers, and Mr. Hajbaz had remained sleek and fat. It was mid-December, she said, when he had not appeared one night to her call, nor had she seen him since, and so I searched, but with a sinking heart in this winter of Holland's hunger. All my searching brought not one single cat or dog to my call. I missed more than the cat or dog. The Beje needed people to fill its rooms. I remembered father's words to the Gestapo chief in The Hague. I will reopen my door to anyone in need. No one in the city was in greater need than its feeble-minded. Since the start of the Nazi occupation, they had been sequestered by their families in back rooms, their schools and training centers shut down, hidden from a government that had decided they were not fit to live. Soon a group of them was living at the Beje. They still could not go out on the streets, but here at least they had new surroundings and a program of sorts, with the time I could take from the shop. And still my restlessness continued. I was home. I was working and busy. Or was I? Often I would come to with a start at my workbench to realize that I had sat for an hour staring into space. The repairmen Tos had found, trained under father, were excellent. I spent less and less time in the shop. Whatever or whoever I was looking for was not there. Nor upstairs. I loved the gentle people in my care, but the house itself had ceased to be home. For Betsy's sake, I bought plants for every windowsill, but I forgot to water them and they died. Maybe I missed the challenge of the underground. When the national group approached me with a request, I agreed eagerly. They had false release papers for a prisoner in the Haarlem jail. What could be simpler than to carry this document around the corner and through those familiar wooden doors? But as the doors closed behind me, my heart began to race. What if I couldn't get out? What if I was trapped? Yes, a young police lieutenant with a bright orange hair stepped from behind the reception desk. You had an appointment? It was Rolf. Why was he being so stiff with me? Was I under arrest? Were they going to put me in a cell? Rolf, I said, don't you know me? He peered at me as though trying to refresh his memory. Of course, he said smoothly. The lady at the watch shop. I heard you were closed down for a while. I gaped at him. Why, Rolf knew perfectly. And then I recalled where we were. In the central foyer of the police station with half a dozen German soldiers looking on. And I had greeted one of our group by name, practically admitted a special relationship between us, when the cardinal rule of the underground was. I ran my tongue over my lips. How could I have been so stupid? Rolf took the forged papers from my shaking hands and glanced through them. These must be passed upon by the police chief and the military overcommand together, he said. Can you return with them tomorrow afternoon at 4? The chief will be in a meeting until I heard no more. After the words tomorrow afternoon, I had bolted for the door. I stood thankfully on the sidewalk until my knees stopped knocking. If I had ever needed proof that I had no boldness or cleverness of my own, I had it now. Whatever bravery or skill I had ever shown were gifts of God. Sheer loans from Him of the talent needed to do a job, and it was clear, from the absence of such skills now, that this was no longer His work for me. I crept meekly back to the Baillet, and it was at that moment, as I stepped into the alley, that I knew what it was I was looking for. It was Betsy. It was Betsy I had missed every moment of every day since I ran to the hospital window and found that she had left Ravensbrück forever. It was Betsy I had thought to find back here in Haarlem, here in the watch shop, in the home she loved. But she was not here, and now, for the first time since her death, I remembered. We must tell people, Corey. We must tell him what we learned. That very week I began to speak. If this was God's new work for me, then He would provide the courage and the words. Through the streets and suburbs of Haarlem, I bumped on my bicycle rims, bringing the message that joy runs deeper than despair. It was news that people needed to hear that cheerless spring of 1945. No Bride of Haarlem tree filled the air with fragrance. Only the stump had been too big to haul off for firewood. No tulips turned fields into carpets of color. The bulbs had all been eaten. No family was without its tragedy. In churches and clubrooms and private homes, in those desperate days, I told the truths Betsy and I had learned in Ravensbrück. And always at these meetings I spoke of Betsy's first vision, of a home here in Holland where those who had been hurt could learn to live again unafraid. At the close of one of these talks, a slender, aristocratic lady came up to me. I knew her by sight, Mrs. Behrens of De Haan, whose home in the suburb of Bloemendaal was said to be one of the most beautiful in Holland. I had never seen it, only the trees at the edge of the huge park in which it was set, and so I was astonished when this elegantly dressed lady asked me if I were still living in the ancient little house on the Bartholdjorgenstraat. How did you? Yes, I do, but my mother often told me about it. She went there frequently to see an aunt of yours who, I believe, was in charitable work. In a rush it all came back, opening the side door to let in a swish of satin and rustle of feathers, a long gown, and a plumed hat brushing both sides of the narrow stairs. Then Tante Jans, standing in her doorway with a look that froze in the bones the thought of bouncing a ball. I am a widow, Mrs. Behrens de Haan was saying, but I have 5 sons in the resistance. 4 are still alive and well. The 5th we have not heard from since he was taken to Germany. As you spoke just now, something in me kept saying, John will come back, and in gratitude you will open your home for this vision of Betsy ten Boom. It was 2 weeks later that a small boy delivered a scented envelope to the side door. Inside, in slanted purple letters, was a single line, John is home. Mrs. Behrens de Haan herself met me at the entrance to her estate. Together we walked up an avenue of ancient oaks, meeting above our heads. Rounding the final bend, we saw it. A 56-room mansion in the center of a vast lawn. Two elderly gardeners were poking about the flower beds. "We've let the gardens go," Mrs. Bjornstern said, "but I thought we might put them back in shape. Don't you think released prisoners might find therapy in growing things?" I didn't answer. I was staring up at the gabled roof and the leaded windows. Such tall windows. Are there, my throat was dry, are there inlaid wood floors inside, and a grand gallery around a central hall, and the bas-relief statues set along the walls? Mrs. Bjornstern looked at me in surprise. "You've been here then? I don't recall." "No," I said. "I heard about it from—" I stopped. How could I explain what I did not understand? "From someone who's been here," she finished simply, not understanding my perplexity. "Yes," I said, "from someone who's been here." The second week in May, the Allies retook Holland. The Dutch flag hung from every window, and the Wilhelmus was played on the liberated radio day and night. The Canadian army rushed to the cities the food they had stockpiled along the borders. In June, the first of many hundreds of people arrived at the beautiful home in Bloemendaal, silent or endlessly relating their losses, withdrawn or fiercely aggressive. Everyone was a damaged human being. Not all had been in concentration camps. Some had spent 2, 3, even 4 years hidden in attic rooms and back closets here in Holland. One of the first of these was Mrs. Kahn, widow of the watch shop owner up the street. Mr. Kahn had died at the underground address. She came to us alone, a stooped, white-haired woman who startled at every sound. Others came to Bloemendaal, scarred body and soul by bombing raids or loss of family, or any of the endless dislocations of war. In 1947, we began to receive Dutch people who had been prisoners of the Japanese in Indonesia. Though none of this was by design, it proved to be the best possible setting for those who had been imprisoned in Germany. Among themselves, they tended to live and relive their special woes. In Bloemendaal, they were reminded that they were not the only ones who had suffered, and for all these people alike, the key to healing turned out to be the same. Each had a hurt he had to forgive. The neighbor who had reported him, the brutal guard, the sadistic soldier. Strangely enough, it was not the Germans or the Japanese that people had most trouble forgiving. It was their fellow Dutchmen who had sided with the enemy. I saw them frequently in the streets, the NSB'ers, with their shaved heads and furtive eyes. These former collaborators were now in pitiful condition, turned out of homes and apartments, unable to find jobs, hooted at in the streets. At first it seemed to me that we should invite them too to Bloemendaal, to live side by side with those they had injured, to seek a new compassion on both sides. But it turned out to be too soon for people working their way back from such hurt. The 2 times I tried it, it ended up in open fights. And as soon as homes and schools for the feeble-minded opened again around the country, I turned the Beje over to these former NSB'ers. This was how it went. Those years after the war, experimenting, making mistakes, learning, the doctors, psychiatrists, and nutritionists who came free of charge to any place that cared for war victims, sometimes expressed surprise at our loose-run ways. At morning and evening worship, people drifted in and out. Table manners were atrocious. One man took a walk into Harlem every morning at 3 a.m. I could not bring myself to sound a whistle, or to scold, or to consider gates or curfews. And sure enough, in their own time and their own way, people worked out the deep pain within them. It most often started as Betsy had known it would, in the garden. As flowers bloomed or vegetables ripened, talk was less of the bitter past, more of tomorrow's weather. As their horizons broadened, I would tell them about the people living in the Bayou, people who never had a visitor, never had a piece of mail. When mention of the N.S. Beers no longer brought on a volley of self-righteous wrath, I knew the person's healing was not far away. And the day he said, "Those people you spoke of, I wonder if they'd care for some homegrown carrots," then I knew the miracle had taken place. I continued to speak, partly because the home in Bloemendaal ran on contributions, partly because the hunger for Betsy's story seemed to increase with time. I traveled all over Holland, to other parts of Europe, to the United States. But the place where the hunger was the greatest was Germany. Germany was a land in ruin, cities of ashes and rubble, but more terrifying still, minds and hearts of ashes. Just across the border was to feel the great weight that hung over that land. Excuse me. It was at a church service in Munich that I saw him, the former SS man who had stood guard at the shower room door in the processing center at Ravensbrück. He was the first of our actual jailers that I had seen since that time, and suddenly it was all there. The room full of mocking men, the heaps of clothing, Betsy's pain-blanched face. He came up to me as the church was emptying, beaming and bowing. "How grateful I am for your message, Fraulein," he said. "To think that, as you say, he has washed my sins away." His hand was thrust out to shake mine, and I, who had preached so often to the people in Bloemendaal the need to forgive, kept my hand at my side. Even as the angry, vengeful thoughts boiled through me, I saw the sin of them. Jesus Christ had died for this man. Was I going to ask for more? "Lord Jesus," I prayed, "forgive me and help me to forgive him." I tried to smile. I struggled to raise my hand. I could not. I felt nothing, not the slightest spark of warmth or charity. And so again I breathed a silent prayer. "Jesus, I cannot forgive him. Give your forgiveness." As I took his hand, the most incredible thing happened. From my shoulder, along my arm, and through my hand, a current seemed to pass from me to him, while into my heart sprang a love for this stranger that almost overwhelmed me. And so I discovered that it is not on our forgiveness any more than on our goodness that the world's healing hinges, but on his. When he tells us to love our enemies, he gives, along with the command, the love itself. It took a lot of love. The most pressing need in post-war Germany was homes. 9 million people were said to be without them. They were living in rubble heaps, half-standing buildings, and abandoned army trucks. A church group invited me to speak to 100 families living in an abandoned factory building. Sheets and blankets had been hung between the various living quarters to make a pretense of privacy. But there was no insulating the sounds. The wail of a baby, the din of radios, the angry words of a family quarrel. How could I speak to these people of the reality of God and then go back to my quiet room in the church hostel outside the city? No, before I could bring a message to them, I would have to live among them. And it was during the months that I spent in the factory that a director of a relief organization came to see me. They had heard of my rehabilitation work in Holland, he said, and they wondered. I was opening my mouth to say that I had no professional training in such things when his next words silenced me. We've located a place for the work, he said. It was a former concentration camp that's been released by the government. We drove to Darmstadt to look over the camp. Rolls of rusting barbed wire still surrounded it. I walked slowly up a cinder path between drab gray barracks. I pushed open a creaking door. I stepped between rows of metal cots. Window boxes, I said. We'll have them at every window. The barbed wire must come down, of course. And then we'll need paint. Green paint. Bright yellow-green. The color of things coming up new in the spring. And that is the end of chapter 15 of The Hiding Place. There is a bit more telling of what is going on now or at the writing of this book to Corey and the ministry that God began. But I'm going to leave you here. And if you're interested, you can go to the website, and I will give you the website. I'll put it in the comments below. I'll put it in the comments below. But until we meet again, this is the end of The Hiding Place. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May He make His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up His countenance upon you and grant you His peace. Shalom.